Welcome back, friends. Pull up a chair and let the fire warm you. Out on the unforgiving frontier, cruelty didn't always come from a loaded iron. Sometimes it came from the sharp tongues of folks who called themselves righteous. The dusty staging yard of Oakhaven was sweltering, but the chill radiating from the gathered crowd was enough to freeze water. Clara knelt in the pulverized dirt, her trembling hands desperately trying to gather the meager belongings spilling from her shattered trunk. Her late husband's sister stood above her, lip curled in absolute disgust. "You are a massive, worthless burden," the woman sneered, her voice slicing through the heavy air. "We fed you out of pity, but no wagon is wide enough for a widow of your proportions. Go rot." Laughter rippled through the onlookers, sharp and unrelenting. Clara sobbed silently, squeezing her eyes shut, a heavy tear tracking down her flushed, rounded cheek as she braced for another cruel kick. But the blow never landed. A shadow, vast and impenetrable, suddenly swallowed the blinding midday sun. The laughter choked out in an instant, replaced by a suffocated silence. Elias stood there. 6.5 feet of immovable mountain muscle, his heavy duster sweeping the dust, staring down the cruel sisters-in-law Vikeptehat, eyes like glacial ice. "Step away from her," he demanded, his voice a dangerous low rumble that shook the very floorboards of the stagecoach now. "Before we follow these two out onto that long, dusty trail, if you are finding comfort by our fire today, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. It lets me know you want to hear more of these tales from the old frontier, where true strength was shown through quiet kindness, not cruelty. Now let us go back to that sweltering staging yard in Oakhaven, where the air had grown so thick you could cut it with a skinning knife. The silence stretching across the dirt was absolute. Not a single soul dared to draw a full breath. Elias did not move a muscle, but his towering frame seemed to expand, casting a long, impenetrable shadow over Clara. The cruel sister-in-law recoiled, her haughty posture crumbling instantly under the weight of his glacial stare. She opened her mouth, perhaps to spit another venomous insult, but the words died in her throat. The sheer, dominating authority radiating from this giant of a man was suffocating. He did not raise a hand. He did not need to. His presence alone was an immovable mountain, and the townsfolk, who had been laughing just moments before, suddenly found the tops of their boots incredibly fascinating. They scattered like frightened quail, melting away into the stifling heat of the afternoon, leaving the cruel woman completely isolated. She swallowed hard, her face draining of color, before hitching up her skirts and scurrying away without a backward glance. Clara remained anchored to the dust. Her heavy, rounded shoulders shook with silent, tearing sobs. She was paralyzed, entirely unable to comprehend the sudden shift in the world around her. For years, her sheer size had made her an easy target, a monument for their cruelty, and she had internalized every wicked barb until she believed she was nothing more than an inconvenience taking up 2 mo'ushe hat room on the earth. Now an absolute stranger had halted her public execution with a mere whisper of his boots and a stare that could freeze a rushing river. She squeezed her eyes shut, instinctively bracing herself, fully expecting this massive stranger to turn his ire upon her. Instead, the distinct creak of heavy leather echoed near her ears. Elias had knelt in the dirt beside her. The movement was slow, deliberate, signaling no threat. Clara peeked through her wet lashes, her breath hitching wildly. His hands were enormous. Thick, calloused, scarred from years of unforgiving labor in the wilderness, they looked entirely capable of crushing stone. Yet those massive hands reached out and gently gathered her scattered, frayed belongings. He picked up a chipped wooden comb, a torn piece of lace, and a small, battered tintype photograph of her parents, brushing the prairie dust from them with agonizing care. The contrast between his brutal, rugged size and the extreme gentleness of his motions sent a violent shiver down Clara's spine. She shrank back, trying to fold her generous curves into a smaller shape, desperately trying to become invisible. "You dropped these, Ma'am," Elias murmured, his voice a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the arid air. It held no pity. Pity was a condescending thing, a tool used by the townspeople to justify their scraps of charity. His voice held only a profound, quiet respect. Clara reached out, her plump, trembling fingers brushing against his weathered knuckles as she took the items. A jolt of pure, terrifying warmth shot up her arm. She snatched her hands back, burying her face in her chest. "Thank you," she whimpered, the sound barely audible over the rising wind. Elias stood, unfolding his massive frame until he towered over her once more. He looked down at her battered trunk, its leather straps ruined by the sister-in-law's vicious kicks. Without a word, he bent down, gripped the thick ropes on either side, and hoisted the heavy chest onto his broad shoulder as if it weighed no more than a bundle of dry kindling. "Which wagon?" he asked. Clara blinked up at him, entirely bewildered. The tears tracking through the dust on her flushed cheeks made her look exceptionally vulnerable, a fragile soul trapped within a lush, heavy form. They took my ticket, she confessed, the shame burning hot in her chest. They said Mott would break the axles. That Mott him too. Too much to carry over the mountains. A muscle feathered tightly in Elias' jaw. The stoic mask he wore slipped for just a fraction of a second, revealing a flash of absolute fury. But he quickly wrestled it down. He would not frighten her. You are traveling to the new settlement in the basin, he stated. A fact rather than a question. He knew the route. Everyone in this yard was waiting for the westbound freight caravan. Come with me. He turned and walked toward the largest supply wagon at the head of the train. It was a massive reinforced Studebaker rig, pulled by a team of 6 draft horses, built to haul heavy iron and winter supplies over the treacherous mountain passes. Clara hesitated, her boots rooted to the dirt. She was terrified. This man was a giant, a stranger, and she had learned the hard way that men only paid attention to her to mock her deep, soft curves or to use her as a beast of burden. But looking around the empty staging yard, the realization crashed over her. She had nothing, no home, no family, no money. She clutched her torn shawl tightly around her full bosom and forced her leaden legs to move, trailing behind him like a frightened shadow. The wagon master, a wiry, sour-faced man with a permanent scowl, stood by the lead wagon holding a ledger. He looked up, his eyes widening slightly as Elias approached with the trunk. Hold on there, Elias, the wagon master barked, tapping his pencil against the book. Molt told that widow woman she ain't riding. She too heavy. Takes up the room of 2 paying fares and the pass is steep this year. I ain't risking my beasts or my wheels for someone who can even afford a half fare. Clara stopped dead in her tracks, 10 paces away, the familiar, crushing weight of humiliation pressing down on her lungs. She bowed her head, fresh tears welling in her doe-like eyes. It was always the same. Her body was a sin she could not apologize enough for. She turned slightly, preparing to walk away into the unforgiving wilderness alone, preparing to surrender to the fate her cruel in-laws had decreed for her. Put her on my manifest, Elias commanded. The timbre of his voice dropped an octave, resonating with a lethal calm that halted Clara in her steps. He swung her trunk effortlessly into the back of the wagon, the heavy wood thudding solidly against the floorboards. He reached into his canvas duster, retrieving a heavy leather pouch. She rides on the bench with me. The wagon master scoffed, crossing his arms, looking entirely unimpressed by the monumental shift in the atmosphere. Mort just told you, she takes up too much room. The bench ain't built for a giant like you and a woman of her proportions. And the toll for the extra weight. Elias did not let him finish. He tossed the leather pouch. It struck the wagon master's chest with a heavy metallic clink. The man scrambled to catch it, opening the drawstrings to reveal the glint of solid gold eagles. That covers 3 full fares, Elias stated, stepping closer, utilizing his immense height to cast a dark shadow over the sputtering wagon master. And it covers the silence of every man on this train regarding her presence. Do we have a clear understanding, or do Mot need to find another caravan to haul my winter freight? The wagon master swallowed nervously, quickly tucking the heavy gold into his vest pocket. Elias was not just a passing traveler. He was the wealthiest rancher in the basin, funding half the vital supplies on this very train. To lose his patronage meant ruining the entire expedition. Clear as mountain water, Mr. Vance, the man muttered, stepping aside hastily, his previous bravado completely vanishing under the crushing weight of Elias' authority. Elias turned back to Clara. She stood trembling, her wide brown eyes locked on to him in sheer disbelief. No one had ever defended her. No one had ever paid for her. She was a burden, a cast-off, a woman who had spent the last 3 years of her marriage apologizing endlessly for the physical space she occupied. To witness a man of such immense power leverage his fortune to secure her safety shattered everything she understood about the world. Elias walked back to her, his massive boots kicking up small clouds of golden dust in the late afternoon sun. He stopped a respectful distance away, allowing her plenty of space to breathe. The wagon is ready, ma'am, he offered softly, the rough edges of his deep voice sanding down to something remarkably tender. Clara swallowed the thick lump in her throat, her voice barely squeak. You did not have to do that, sir. Mot have no way to repay you. Mot have absolutely nothing left. Elias tipped the brim of his weathered Stetson, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath hitch. I did not ask for payment. Mort asked for your company on a long ride. Now let us get you out of this brutal sun. He guided her toward the massive Studebaker wagon. The bench seat was impossibly high, sitting above the massive iron-reinforced wooden wheels. Clara stared up at it, a new wave of panic rising swiftly in her chest. Her heavy, worn dress tangled around her thick ankles, and her body was utterly exhausted from the relentless trauma of the morning. There was simply no way she could climb up there gracefully. She reached for the iron handrail, her knuckles turning bone white, but she could not pull her heavy frame upward. A flush of deep, mortifying crimson crept up her neck and engulfed her cheeks. She was failing again. She was proving them all right. She was too large, too clumsy, too broken. "Forgive me," Elias murmured, stepping up directly behind her. Before Clara could register his intent, two massive hands spanned her wide waist. His grip was extraordinarily firm, yet intensely mindful, his long fingers easily accommodating the thick, soft curves of her midsection without squeezing or pressing improperly. He did not grunt. He did not strain in the slightest. With a smooth, effortless motion that defied human strength, he lifted her entirely off the ground. Clara gasped, a short, startled sound escaping her parted lips as she experienced the terrifying, exhilarating sensation of complete weightlessness. In a heartbeat, she was deposited gently onto the wide wooden bench. She gripped the edge of the seat, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs, completely astounded. He had lifted her heavy form as if she were made of nothing but prairie wind and feathers. Elias climbed up beside her, the sturdy wagon groaning slightly under his immense weight. Even on the extra-wide bench, his broad shoulders commanded a vast amount of space. Clara immediately pressed herself against the far edge, curling her rounded shoulders inward, desperately trying to compress her large body against the wooden railing. She wanted to shrink. She wanted to disappear completely into the cracks of the polished wood so she would not crowd him. The wagon master cracked his long bullwhip, and with a lurching groan of ancient timber and heavy iron, the massive caravan finally began to roll forward, leaving the absolute cruelty of Oakhaven behind them in the choking dust. The journey out of the staging yard was rough and merciless. The trail was heavily rutted, baked hard as stone by the relentless summer sun. Every bump jolted the heavy wagon, sending brutal shockwaves up through the wooden bench. Clara bit her lip hard enough to draw blood to stifle a groan as a particularly deep rut threw her sideways. She caught herself fiercely on the railing, utterly terrified of accidentally brushing against the giant man seated beside her. She kept her eyes glued securely to her scuffed boots, her hands wrung so tightly in her lap her fingers ached. Elias drove the 6-horse team with effortless, practiced grace, his massive, calloused hands managing the thick leather reins as if they were delicate silk threads. He did not look at her directly, respecting the fragile boundaries she was trying to maintain, but his keen peripheral vision caught every flinch, every wince, every desperate attempt she made to fold herself into nothingness. He recognized the posture instantly. It was the tragic posture of a beaten creature, of a soul that had been struck down so many times it anticipated the next blow from the very wind itself. It ignited a slow, simmering fire deep within his chest, a profound, protective fury against whoever had broken this beautiful woman's spirit so thoroughly. The landscape slowly shifted from the flat, dusty scrublands into the rolling, golden foothills of the territory. The sun beat down mercilessly from a cloudless sky, heating the thick canvas cover behind them until it radiated heat like a blacksmith oven. Clara was sweltering inside her heavy, dark wool dress, but she dared not remove her frayed shawl. The thick fabric served as armor, hiding the generous swell of her bosom and the soft thickness of her upper arms, features she had been relentlessly mocked for. She suffered the stifling heat in agonizing silence, tiny beads of sweat gathering at her temples, her breathing growing shallow and rapid. Behind them, riding in the relative comfort of the passenger compartment of the following wagon, a shrill, piercing voice cut completely through the rhythmic creaking of the wheels. Mort simply cannot believe he paid for that enormous creature. She is bound to snap the axle before we reach the summit. Look at the sheer size of her. It is an absolute offense to the eyes. It was Mrs. Gable, a wealthy merchant wife, who had been quietly judging Clara since they first arrived at the staging yard. Clara's breath caught violently in her throat. The cruel words struck her back like physical lashes from a whip. She closed her eyes tight, a single hot tear slipping free and tracking down her cheek. She braced herself, fully preparing to be stopped and abandoned at the very next mile marker. Elias did not turn around immediately. He did not shout. He simply hauled back on the massive leather reins with a terrifying sudden force. The 6 heavy draft horses halted instantly, digging their massive hooves deep into the dirt. The supply wagon stopped with a violent jerk, causing the entire caravan behind them to pile up, horses whinnying loudly in confusion. The silence that followed was absolute, save for the lonely howling of the prairie wind moving through the dry sagebrush. Elias calmly secured the heavy iron brake. He stood up slowly on the wooden footboard, turning his massive frame to look over the canvas of his wagon directly into the passenger rig directly behind them. His glacial blue eyes locked precisely onto Mrs. Gable. The woman's smug, judgmental expression vanished instantly, replaced by sheer, suffocating terror as the giant of a man stared her down. "This caravan stops when Moat say it stops," Elias warned, his voice carrying clearly over the rustling landscape, a low, dangerous rumble that promised absolute ruin. "And if another word of disrespect leaves your mouth regarding the lady sitting beside me, Moat will unhitch my team, take my winter supplies, and leave you all to walk across the barren basin without a drop of water. Do Moat make myself perfectly clear?" Mrs. Gable visibly trembled, pressing herself deeply into the corner of her carriage, her face entirely devoid of color. She nodded frantically, utterly unable to form a single cohesive word. Elias held her terrified gaze for 3 agonizingly long seconds, establishing absolute dominance without raising a single fist before turning back to his seat. He released the iron brake, snapped the heavy reins, and the wagon lurched forward once more. Clara sat frozen, her chest heaving wildly. He had called her a lady, not a creature, not a burden, a lady. The realization was so profoundly alien, so entirely unexpected, that it made her dizzy with shock. The long hours dragged on, each passing mile harder and more exhausting than the last. The relentless sun finally began its slow, fiery descent toward the jagged, snow-capped mountain peaks in the far distance, painting the vast western sky in bruised hues of deep purple and brilliant gold. The temperature plummeted rapidly across the open plains, the searing heat giving way to the biting, merciless chill of a frontier evening. Clara shivered violently, her exhausted, traumatized body trembling completely beneath her thin, useless shawl. Her back ached with a deep, throbbing pain from holding herself so rigidly away from Elias for 10 straight hours. The emotional adrenaline that had kept her upright throughout the terrifying morning was crashing hard, leaving behind nothing but a hollow, overwhelming exhaustion that threatened to pull her under. Elias watched her intently from the corner of his eye. He noticed the dark, heavy circles bruising the delicate skin under her expressive brown eyes. He noticed the slight, pitiful tremble in her plump, soft lips as the cold wind whipped across the bench. She was fighting a desperate, losing battle against exhaustion, her heavy head nodding forward, then snapping back up as raw panic gripped her anew. She was terrified of falling asleep, terrified of losing her rigid physical control, terrified of slipping and leaning into his space, fully expecting him to shove her away in disgust. As the weary caravan finally pulled into a small sheltered grove of cottonwood trees to make camp for the night, Elias finally broke the heavy, prolonged silence that rested between them. "You are running on fumes, Clara," he noted gently, using the name he had spotted carved into the side of her broken trunk. Hearing her name spoken with such profound softness, rather than hissed with venom or shouted in anger, startled her completely. She looked up at him, her emotional defenses completely worn away by the sheer length of the day, leaving only a raw, terrified vulnerability in her gaze. She did not know what the long night would bring, or how she would possibly survive the grueling weeks ahead on this trail. But as the giant cowboy secured the heavy reins and turned his absolute, undivided attention directly to her, Clara realized for the very first time in her tragic life she was not standing in the firing line entirely alone. Before we travel further into the dark, friends, let me tell you about the true nature of a frontier night. The sun vanished completely behind the jagged mountain peaks, plunging the vast plains into a sudden, unforgiving darkness. Out there, night did not fall gently. It dropped like a heavy iron anvil, bringing a bitter, biting cold that sought out every gap in your clothing. The wagon master ordered the caravan to circle up within the small grove of ancient cottonwood trees. It was a practiced maneuver, the heavy wagons forming a barricade against the howling wind and whatever predators stalked the high grass. Clara sat rigidly on the high bench, her thick fingers locked around the iron rail, her knuckles aching with a dull, throbbing pain. The brutal jolting of the wagon had finally ceased, but her body still vibrated with the phantom motion of the long ride. She watched as the other travelers began to dismount, their faces pinched with exhaustion and lingering malice. They formed their own tight groups, casting dark, sidelong glances toward the massive Studebaker rig where she and Elias sat. The isolation was palpable, a heavy curtain drawn between them and the rest of the camp. Mrs. Gable scurried past, her nose tilted so high she nearly tripped over a tree root, pulling her family far away to the opposite side of the circle. Clara felt that familiar, suffocating wave of shame kepa et hat over her chest. She felt like a disease they were all trying to avoid catching, a massive, unseemly burden that offended their delicate sensibilities. She swallowed hard, trying to push down the rising tide of panic. In her previous life, standing still meant she was being lazy, and being lazy meant she would be punished, mocked, or denied her meager rations. Her sister-in-law had driven that lesson deep into her bones, forcing her to haul, scrub, and carry until her soft hands bled, constantly reminding her that a woman of her size must earn the air she breathed through grueling labor. That conditioning was a vicious, heavy chain around her neck. She could not just sit there while others worked. She had to prove her worth, even to this terrifying giant of a man who had purchased her passage. Elias stepped down from the wagon, his massive boots hitting the dirt with a solid, reassuring thud. He began unhitching the team of 6 heavy draft horses, his movements methodical and incredibly smooth for a man of his monumental size. He did not ask for her help, nor did he look at her with any expectation, but Clara was already scrambling down from the bench. Her descent was clumsy, her heavy skirt tangling around her thick legs, and she landed hard in the dust, her knees buckling slightly. She bit her lip to stifle a whimper of pain, quickly smoothing her dress and looking around frantically for a task. The camp needed water. The creek was a dark, winding ribbon about 50 yards away, barely visible in the fading twilight. Near the wagon master's rig, 2 massive, iron-bound wooden buckets sat empty. They were designed for the draft animals, meant to be carried by 2 grown men using a thick wooden yoke. Clara did not think, she just moved. She rushed over, her breath coming in short panic gasps, and grabbed the thick rope handles. They were incredibly heavy, even empty, the rough fibers biting instantly into her tender, blistered palms. She dragged them toward the creek, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs, terrified that someone would yell at her for being too slow. The wind whipped her frayed shawl away from her shoulders, exposing her to the sudden, brutal drop in temperature, but she ignored the violent shivering that overtook her heavy frame. She reached the muddy bank of the creek, sinking ankle-deep into the freezing muck, and plunged the first bucket into the rushing water. The sheer weight of the full barrel nearly pulled her face first into the icy current. She strained backward, her soft, rounded shoulders screaming in agony as she hauled it onto the bank. She filled the second one, her vision blurring with hot, frustrated tears. She was so tired, so profoundly exhausted that her bones felt like lead, yet the terror of being useless drove her forward. She grabbed both handles, bracing her wide hips, and pulled. The buckets barely moved. She pulled harder, a ragged sob tearing from her throat, the coarse rope tearing the fragile skin from her palms, leaving slick, warm blood against the coarse hemp. She managed to drag them 3 agonizing steps up the bank before her boot slipped in the mud. She crashed hard onto her knees, the freezing water splashing violently over her heavy skirt, soaking her completely to the bone. She stayed there in the mud, paralyzed by her failure, waiting for the harsh, mocking laughter, waiting for the cruel insults about her size and her clumsiness to rain down from the darkness. Instead of laughter, a heavy, solid silence fell over the creek bank. A massive shadow eclipsed the pale moonlight. Elias materialized beside her, moving with a silent grace that completely defied his towering muscular frame. He did not look at her at pity, and he certainly did not look at her with disgust. His glacial blue eyes scanned her trembling form, taking in her bruised knees, her bleeding hands, and the soaked hem of her heavy dress. A muscle feathered dangerously in his strong, square jaw, a silent testament to the immense, simmering fury he held for the people who had shattered her spirit so thoroughly. He crouched down, his huge frame dwarfing her completely, blocking the biting prairie wind like a solid brick wall. He did not yell, he did not scold her. He simply reached out and pried her trembling, bloody fingers from the rough rope handles. His touch was incredibly warm, entirely steady, and agonizingly gentle against her torn skin. He looked directly into her wide, terrified brown eyes and murmured softly that she did not need to earn her place by his fire. The words were a low, resonant rumble that vibrated through the frigid air, carrying an absolute, immovable authority. Clara stared at him, her chest heaving, entirely unable to comprehend the concept. She whispered brokenly that she had to work, that she was too heavy, too large to be carried for free, that she would be thrown away if she did not haul her share. The deep sorrow in her voice was enough to crack solid stone. Elias slowly shook his head, refusing completely to accept the vicious lies she had been fed. He stood up, towering over her, and effortlessly lifted the 2 massive waterlogged wooden buckets, one in Iagjehat hand, as if they were nothing more than empty tin cups. He did not strain, he did not grunt, his broad shoulders easily bearing a weight that would have broken a lesser man. He looked down at her, his expression an impenetrable fortress of calm, and told her to stand up and walk back to the wagon. He stated it simply not as a request, but as a protective command, removing the burden of choice from her exhausted shoulders. Clara scrambled to her feet, her soaked skirt clinging heavily to her legs, shivering violently as the freezing wind hit the wet fabric and followed his massive silhouette back into the safety of the camp. The contrast between their isolated spot and the rest of the caravan was stark. The other travelers huddled around meager, smoky fires, hoarding their small rations, their faces tight with anxiety and bitter cold. Elias led Clara to a sheltered alcove created by the massive rear wheels of his wagon and a thick cluster of cottonwood trunks. He set the heavy buckets down without spilling a single drop and turned his undivided attention to building a fire. He worked with methodical efficiency, his large hands arranging the dry kindling and thick logs, striking a flint until a brilliant roaring blaze sprang to life. The heat was immediate and glorious, pushing back the oppressive, suffocating dark of the frontier night. Elias fetched a heavy woven woolen blanket from the back of the wagon, shaking off the prairie dust, and draped it carefully over a thick log positioned close to the flames. He looked at Clara, who was standing awkwardly on the edge of the firelight, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached, still too terrified to presume she was allowed to sit. He gestured toward the makeshift seat, his voice a deep, quiet rumble, telling her to sit down and dry her dress. Clara hesitated for a fraction of a second, her ingrained fears warring with her desperate, freezing reality, before her exhausted legs simply gave out. She collapsed onto the blanketed log, pulling her thick curves tightly together, leaning eagerly toward the life-saving heat. She watched in silent awe as Elias moved around their camp. There was an incredible, mesmerizing grace to his immense size. He retrieved a heavy cast-iron Dutch oven, a thick slab of salted bacon, dry beans, and a small sack of coffee. In her previous life, meals were absolute battlegrounds. Her sister-in-law would serve the men first, taking the prime cuts of meat, leaving Clara Ve, kepte hat, watery broth, and hardened scraps, loudly proclaiming that someone of her generous proportions certainly did not need any more food. Clara instinctively braced herself for the same cruel treatment. She watched him slice the thick bacon, the rich, intoxicating scent of sizzling fat and roasting beans filling the frigid air, making her empty stomach cramp violently with hunger. She averted her eyes, staring at her muddy boots, completely preparing herself to accept whatever meager, burnt offerings he might toss her way once he had eaten his fill. Elias pulled the heavy iron pot from the flames, the stew bubbling with a thick, savory richness. He took out 2 clean tin plates and served the hot food. Clara kept her head bowed, her wet hands clasped tightly in her lap, waiting for the heavy thud of a plate being shoved unceremoniously onto the dirt near her feet. Instead, a large, calloused hand entered her field of vision, holding a plate heaped high with thick cuts of bacon, steaming beans, and a large piece of dense camp bread. Elias held it out to her, waiting patiently for her to take it. Clara looked up, her doe-like eyes wide with absolute shock. She looked from the heaping plate to his rugged face, entirely confused. She whispered that she could not possibly eat all of that he needed his strength, that she only needed a little bit of the broth. Elias did not withdraw the plate. He remained perfectly still, his glacial eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath hitch painfully in her throat. He told her in a low, unwavering voice that out here, they ate together, and they ate well. He instructed her to take the plate, his tone leaving absolutely no room for her self-deprecating arguments. Trembling, Clara reached out, her thick fingers brushing gently against his warm knuckles as she took the heavy tin. The warmth of the food seeped into her freezing hands, but it was absolutely nothing compared to the profound, shattering warmth that bloomed in her chest. She took a small, tentative bite. The rich, salty flavor exploded in her mouth, completely overwhelming her senses. It was the first proper, hearty meal she had been given in years. The sheer, unadulterated kindness of the simple gesture finally broke the emotional dam she had been holding back all day. A single heavy tear slipped down her flushed, rounded cheek, splashing silently into the stew. She ate slowly, savoring every morsel, crying quietly into her food, profoundly moved by a man who saw her heavy frame not as a target for mockery, but as a person entirely deserving of sustenance and care. As the long evening wore on, the temperature continued its brutal, merciless plummet. The wind howling across the plains grew much sharper, carrying the distinct, biting promise of heavy frost. Across the camp, the townspeople were suffering greatly. Their thin fires offered little protection, and their constant, bitter complaining echoed loudly through the barren trees. Mrs. Gable sat shivering violently in her expensive carriage, wrapping herself in useless, thin silk shawls, casting envious, venomous glares toward the massive, roaring fire Elias had built. Clara finished her meal, setting the tin plate carefully by her boots, but the creeping cold was beginning to conquer the heat of the flames. Her wet dress had partially dried, but the damp chill had seeped deep into her fragile bones. She pulled her frayed, useless shawl tighter around her generous bosom, curling her shoulders inward, trying desperately to make herself as small as possible to conserve body heat. Her exhaustion was absolute, a heavy, crushing weight that pressed down on her eyelids, but she fought the urge to sleep with every ounce of her remaining strength. To sleep meant to lose control, to slouch, to take up more space, to become utterly vulnerable. She sat rigidly upright, her spine aching, her neck stiff, shivering so violently her teeth rattled in her skull. Elias sat directly across the fire, his long legs stretched out loosely, drinking black coffee from a battered tin cup. He appeared completely unaffected by the freezing temperature, his thick, muscular body radiating its own immense, natural heat. He watched her carefully over the rim of his cup, his sharp eyes catching every suppressed shudder, every tight grimace of pain that crossed her soft, beautiful features. He saw the desperate, agonizing battle she was fighting against her own deep exhaustion. He knew she was terrified of him, terrified of the space she occupied, terrified of simply existing and letting her guard down. Elias set his empty cup on a flat stone. He stood up slowly, his towering frame casting a massive protective shadow over the flickering firelight. He unbuttoned his heavy dark brown canvas duster, sliding the incredibly thick wool-lined coat from his broad shoulders. He walked slowly around the fire, his heavy boots making absolutely no sound on the frozen dirt. Clara stiffened instantly as he approached, blind panic flaring in her chest. She thought she had done something wrong, that she had offended him with her violent shivering, that he was coming to demand she move entirely away from the fire. She tried to scramble backward, to give him more room, but she was trapped against the rough bark of the cottonwood log. Elias did not stop. He stepped right into her personal space, looming over her, a mountain of silent, immovable strength. Before she could utter a single word of panicked apology, he took the massive canvas duster and draped it gently over her trembling shoulders. The sheer weight of the coat was astonishing, heavy enough to instantly stop her shivering, cocooning her entirely in thick canvas and wonderfully warm wool. It smelled deeply of cedar, sweet wood smoke, and the clean, natural scent of the wild territory. The heavy fabric easily accommodated her wide shoulders and full curves, wrapping around her large frame like a protective fortress. Clara gasped softly, entirely overwhelmed by the sudden, encompassing warmth. She looked up at him, entirely lost for words, her brown eyes shining brightly with unshed tears in the firelight. Elias did not step away. Instead, he turned and sat down directly on the log beside her. The log was thick, but his immense size meant his heavily muscled tehatai gohat brushed securely against the heavy canvas, now covering her soft wide hip. Clara froze instantly, her breath catching painfully in her throat. She fully expected him to shove her away, to complain loudly about her crowding him, to demand she shrink back into nothingness. He did absolutely none of those things. He settled his massive frame, stretching his long legs out toward the warm fire, claiming his space without demanding she surrender hers. The physical contrast between them was striking. Clara was heavily built, soft and curving, a woman entirely unsuited for the harsh, unforgiving angles of the frontier. Elias was a giant, forged from solid granite and iron, an absolute immovable force of nature. Yet, sitting there beside him, completely engulfed in his massive coat, Clara felt an entirely foreign sensation creeping slowly through her exhausted veins. She felt profoundly, undeniably safe. The wind howled furiously through the barren branches above them, rattling the canvas of the wagons, but not a single breath of cold air touched her fragile form. Elias sat like a brick wall between her and the brutal prairie night, breaking the bitter wind with his broad shoulders, shielding her perfectly from the cruel stares of the camp and the merciless elements. The absolute stillness of his presence was a powerful, silent declaration of protection. Clara stared into the dancing flames, her vision swimming as the crushing weight of her exhaustion finally began to overcome her rigid terror. Her heavy head drooped forward, her chin resting against the thick collar of his coat. She jerked awake instantly, a soft gasp of pure panic escaping her lips, terrified she had leaned on him. She stiffened her spine, forcing her eyes wide open, her neck screaming in violent protest. Elias shifted slightly on the log. He turned his head, his glacial eyes entirely soft, resting his calm gaze on her exhausted, panic-stricken face. He spoke, his voice dropping to an impossibly gentle, resonant whisper that vibrated deep in his massive chest. He told her to rest her head. The words hung suspended in the cold air, completely shattering the very last remaining barriers around her deeply wounded heart. He told her she was safe, that no one would bother her, that she could finally let go. Clara trembled, a fresh wave of tears spilling over her flushed cheeks, tracking down slowly into the collar of his heavy duster. She had spent years continuously apologizing for the heavy weight of her existence, completely convinced that she was nothing more than an offensive burden to everyone around her. Now this towering, terrifying giant of a man was deliberately offering his vast, immovable strength for her to lean upon. She fought it for one agonizing second longer, her ingrained trauma screaming at her to remain vigilant, to remain totally rigid. But the sheer quiet power of his kindness was simply too much to resist. With a broken, trembling sigh, Clara completely surrendered. She allowed her heavy, exhausted body to sway sideways, closing her eyes as the soft, rounded curve of her cheek came to finally rest against the solid, immovable muscle of his massive upper arm. The contact was electric, profound, an absolute anchor dropped into a turbulent, chaotic sea. Elias did not flinch. He did not pull away. He did not complain about her heavy weight. He simply sat there, an absolute pillar of silent strength, adjusting his broad shoulders slightly to make her more comfortable. The fire crackled brightly, casting a warm golden glow over them, as Clara finally, entirely, let go of the immense pain she had carried for so long, finding an impossible, beautiful peace in the quiet shadow of the giant who had chosen to be her shield. Right then, a sharp, sudden crack of a heavy breaking branch echoed loudly from the deep darkness just beyond the wagons, loud enough to cut straight through the howling wind, causing Elias to instantly narrow his eyes toward the dark tree line, his huge body tensing into immediate, lethal readiness without ever disturbing the sleeping woman leaning softly against his side. The tension in the air shifted instantly. While Clara remained anchored to his arm, lost in a heavy, restorative sleep, Elias had become an absolute statue of lethal readiness. His eyes, usually so calm and glacial, were now locked on the wall of blackness beyond the flickering firelight. That snap of wood hadn't been the wind. It was too deliberate, too heavy. His hand, resting near his thigh, tightened almost imperceptibly, his knuckles white against his dark trousers. He didn't wake Clara, nor did he shift his weight. He simply sat there, a protective mountain sheltering her from whatever was lurking in the brush. He held his breath, listening intently, his senses heightened by years of living on the knife's edge of the wilderness. Minutes stretched into an eternity, the silence punctuated only by the crackle of the dying fire and the rhythmic, soft breathing of the woman leaning against him. Then a low, guttural chuff sounded from the shadows. A mountain lion, or perhaps a wolf, scenting the horse camp. Elias didn't reach for a rifle. He knew that a gunshot would only cause a stampede in the tightly packed caravan, potentially injuring the very people he had sworn to keep safe. Instead, he drew a deep, rattling breath into his massive chest and let out a low, guttural rumble of his own, a sound so primal and resonant that it seemed to vibrate the very ground beneath them. It was a sound of absolute apex authority, a warning that this territory was claimed by something much more dangerous than the predator stalking them. The forest fell into an abrupt, unnatural silence. The presence in the darkness lingered for a heartbeat, then, with a soft rustle of leaves, retreated into the safety of the night. Elias exhaled, his muscles slowly uncoiling, though his watchfulness never wavered. He looked down at Clara, her soft face illuminated by the dying embers, and a look of profound, quiet, fierce possessiveness crossed his rugged features. He wasn't just guarding his camp. He was guarding a soul that the world had tried its best to break, and he would not permit anything, man or beast, to touch her. As the pre-dawn hours bled the stars from the sky, the air grew even colder, a deep, bone-chilling frost settling over the camp. Clara stirred, the warmth of the fire having long since faded, and her eyes fluttered open to the pale gray light of a Montana morning. She remained still for a moment, confused by the unfamiliar sensation of weight and warmth. When she realized she was still draped in Elias's heavy duster, her cheek pressed against his solid, powerful shoulder, the memory of the previous night washed over her. A surge of hot, mortifying color rushed to her face. She pulled away instantly, her hands trembling as she tried to gather the coat to return it. "Maud, I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice thick with sleep and crushing guilt. "Maud de not mean to. I don't know how Maud fell asleep on you. I know Maud met far too heavy, Maud shouldn't have." Elias didn't let her finish. He caught her wrists in his massive, warm hands, not to restrain her, but to gently stop her frantic movements. His touch was firm, grounding, and absolutely void of the disgust she always anticipated. "You aren't a burden, Clara," he said, his voice deep and smooth, cutting through her self-deprecation like a blade. "And you didn't take up any space that Mutt was more than happy to give you." He took the duster from her, but instead of putting it back on, he held it around her shoulders again, ensuring she was completely wrapped against the biting cold before he stood up to tend to the horses. The ease with which he dismissed her insecurities felt like a physical weight being lifted from her chest, yet her mind was already spiraling toward the day ahead. She knew that as soon as the sun crested the mountains, the judgment of the camp would begin anew. The morning routine was a blur of activity. The wagon master was shouting orders, horses were being harnessed, and the scent of bitter, burnt coffee filled the air. As Clara climbed back onto the high bench of the Studebaker, she felt 1,000 eyes on her. Mrs. Gable was already sitting in her carriage, her eyes narrowed, whispering frantically to a group of women. Clara felt the familiar urge to shrink, to tuck her curves in, to make herself invisible, but then she felt the bench shift as Elias climbed up beside her. His presence was a physical barricade, a wall of pure, immovable strength that separated her from the cruelty of the world. He didn't say a word to the others, and he didn't need to. He simply took the reins, his posture upright and authoritative, and the caravan began to lurch forward. The road ahead was even more treacherous than the day before, winding into the high passes where the air was thin and the slopes were steep. As they climbed, the landscape changed, shifting into a dramatic vista of pine-covered slopes and rocky crags. But Clara barely noticed the scenery. Her attention was entirely focused on the man beside her. She watched the way his hands worked the leather, the way his jaw stayed set, the way he watched the horizon with an intensity that suggested he was scanning for more than just the road. She wondered about his silence, about the man beneath the giant persona. Why was he traveling alone? Why did he have such an instinct to protect a woman he had never met? She felt a sudden, daring urge to know more about him, but her own sense of unworthiness held her tongue. She was just a widow with nothing to her name, and he was a powerful, wealthy man who seemed to have the world in the palm of his hand. The midday sun didn't bring warmth in the high altitudes. It only highlighted the stark, beautiful indifference of the mountains. They pulled over for a brief rest by a glacial stream, the water so cold it looked like liquid glass. While Elias went to water the team, Clara wandered a few steps toward a patch of wildflowers clinging to the rocky soil. She hadn't been allowed such freedom in years. Everything was usually hurry up, don-to-dawdle, or you taking too long. She looked at a vibrant purple mountain blossom and reached out to touch it, her heart feeling lighter than it had in a decade. A shadow fell over her. It wasn't Elias. She turned to find the wagon master standing there, his face twisted in a sneer. "Enjoying the view, are you?" he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You better go back to that wagon before Vance decides he's done with his charity. A woman like you is meant for the trail, and you just a drain on our supplies." Clara's stomach turned to ice. She opened her mouth to apologize, to tell him she would move faster, but the words were stolen by a sudden booming sound. Elias had appeared from behind the wagon. He didn't walk. He surged forward, his tall frame dwarfing the wagon master instantly. He didn't raise his voice, but his tone was so cold it could have turned the stream to ice. "The lady is resting," he stated, each word measured and heavy with threat. "And if you find the air in this camp too thin to maintain your manners, perhaps you should lead your own train and leave us to finish the journey on our own." The wagon master paled, his bravado dissolving into a stuttering apology, and he retreated as quickly as his legs would carry him. Elias turned to Clara, his expression shifting from lethal to gentle in the blink of an eye. "Are you all right?" he asked, his eyes scanning her face for any sign of distress. Clara nodded, her throat tight. She looked up at him, the giant who had fought for her twice in 2 days, and for the first time she reached out, her hand tentatively brushing the sleeve of his shirt. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why defend me? Moat have nothing to give you." Elias looked down at her, his expression unreadable, and he placed his massive hand over hers, holding it firmly. "You have your spirit, Clara," he replied, his voice a low, resonant hum. "And that is a treasure that men like him will never understand." As the afternoon light began to wane, the caravan reached the most dangerous part of the climb, a narrow shelf-like path carved into the side of the mountain, with a sheer drop-off on one side. The wind began to howl, a fierce, erratic force that threatened to push the wagons off the path. Clara gripped the edge of the bench, her knuckles white, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she watched the heavy iron-rimmed wheels roll inches from the edge of the abyss. The wagon swayed, a sickening, terrifying motion that made her heart leap into her throat. She squeezed her eyes shut, paralyzed by the height and the danger, her mind flashing back to the feeling of abandonment she had experienced when she was pushed from her home. She was sure they were going to fall. She was sure her weight was the final straw that would send the wagon tumbling down the mountainside. She felt a sudden heavy pressure on her shoulder. Elias had reached over, pulling her tightly against his side. "Keep your eyes on me," he commanded, his voice a steady grounding force in the howling wind. "Don't look down, just look at me." Clara obeyed, her eyes locking onto his. In the terrifying roar of the wind and the creaking of the wood, his eyes were the only thing that felt real. He steered the team with one hand while holding her firmly against his chest, his immense size acting as a ballast against the sway of the wagon. The fear began to recede, replaced by a strange, overwhelming sense of security. She realized that even if the mountain collapsed, even if the world itself turned upside down, she was safe as long as she was within the reach of his arms. They cleared the narrow pass, the path widening into a high, flat plateau just as the sun began to set. When the wagon finally came to a halt, Clara was still trembling, but not from fear, from the intensity of the connection that had sparked between them in those final, desperate minutes on the cliffside. Elias didn't immediately let go. He held her for a moment longer than necessary, his hand resting on her back, his gaze lingering on her face with a mixture of protectiveness and something much deeper, something that made her heart race in a way it never had before. The night on the plateau was crisp and clear, the air thin and smelling of pine needles and distant snow. As they set up camp, the mood was different. The exhaustion was still there, but it was accompanied by a quiet, burgeoning intimacy. Elias worked with his usual efficiency, but he moved with a new tenderness, ensuring Clara was settled by the fire before he even touched his own gear. She watched him, realizing that the giant cowboy was not just her protector. He was a man who had built his life on solitude, a man who seemed to carry a weight of his own that he had never shared with anyone. She found herself wanting to know that weight. She wanted to know the source of the sadness that occasionally flickered in the depths of his blue eyes. She wanted to know why a man who could command the attention of a room with a single word chose to spend his days in the lonely, vast silence of the mountains. She stood up, her legs a little steadier now, and walked over to where he was sharpening his hunting knife by the fire. He looked up, his expression softening as he saw her. "You should be resting," he said, though there was no scolding in his tone. Clara smiled, a small, genuine expression that reached her eyes for the first time in years. "Mot met not tired," she lied, though the truth was that the prospect of being awake with him was far more appealing than the silence of a dreamless sleep. She sat down on the ground near him, hugging her knees to her chest. "Tell me about your home," she ventured, her voice soft. "You've spent your life out here, haven't you?" Elias paused, the knife resting in his hand. He looked into the fire, the orange light dancing across his rugged features. He began to speak, not of the wealth he had amassed, but of the peace he had found in the vast, untamed landscape of the territory. He spoke of the mountain passes, the way the seasons changed, and the solitude he had once craved, only to realize that solitude was a cold companion when there was no one to share the beauty with. Clara listened, enthralled, her heart aching for the loneliness he had endured. She realized then that they were two sides of the same coin. She had been broken by the cruelty of society, and he had been hardened by the solitude of the wilderness. Together they were finding a middle ground, a place where they could both finally lay down their burdens. As he talked, she felt a shift in the air, a sense of belonging that she hadn't felt since childhood. She reached out, her hand resting on his knee, a gesture of comfort and connection. He didn't pull away. He covered her hand with his own, his skin warm and calloused, a silent promise of understanding. In that moment, the giant of the frontier and the widow who had been cast aside were just two people finding home in Iagzehat Other, the vast, empty mountains surrounding them no longer a wilderness, but a sanctuary. You might think that after the peaks were conquered, the trail would turn into a smooth stroll, but the frontier had a way of humbling even the proudest travelers. We were crossing the high plateau, that vast, lonely expanse that sat between the jagged teeth of the mountains and the endless golden plains below. The air up there was different, thin, and sharp enough to catch in your throat, and the weather changed with the temperament of a cornered beast. We were deep into the second week of the trek, and for Clara, the world had shifted. The crushing weight of her own perceived worthlessness had started to erode, not because the insults from the other travelers had stopped, far from it, but because of the anchor she had found in Elias. He was a silent presence, a constant moving fortification against the jagged edges of the world. But that afternoon the sky curdled. The bright, endless blue bruised into a deep, sickly shade of violet, and the wind began to howl, not like a breeze, but like something sentient searching for a weak spot to exploit. Mot watched from the sidelines as the caravan slowed. The wagon master, who had been riding Hattagahat after getting through the pass, suddenly looked small and brittle against the backdrop of the roiling clouds. Thunder didn't just rumble. It cracked against the earth, a whiplash sound that set the draft horses stamping in agitation. Elias didn't wait for orders. He knew the signs. His hands, massive and scarred, worked with a speed that defied his calm nature, securing the canvas, checking the iron wheels, and guiding the team toward a natural depression in the landscape, a shallow basin that would offer some protection from the gale that was already whipping up the dust. Clara was beside him, her hands trembling, but she was shrinking anymore. She was watching him, studying the way he moved, the way he calculated the angles of the wind and the stability of the ground. She wasn't terrified of the storm. She was terrified of the possibility that they would be separated, or that he would put himself in danger to secure the wagon. "Get inside, Clara," he commanded, not looking at her, his voice a low, steady rumble that cut through the whistling wind. He didn't offer a choice. He didn't ask if she was frightened. He simply stated the necessity of her safety. She didn't argue. She climbed over the bench, her skirt snagging on a piece of wood, but she didn't apologize. She scrambled into the back of the wagon, surrounded by the scent of canvas, dry hay, and the deep masculine scent of cedar that seemed to cling to everything Elias owned. The wagon was filled with supplies, but he had cleared a space, a nest, really lined with thick, heavy blankets and a bedroll. It was the only dry place in the world. As the first fat drops of rain slammed against the canvas, sounding like stones hitting a tin roof, the rest of the caravan was in chaos. People were scrambling, yelling, their voices thin and panicked in the rising roar of the storm. Elias leaped up into the back with her, bringing the darkness of the sky with him. He hauled the heavy canvas flap shut and lashed it tight, sealing them into a world that was suddenly intimate, small, and utterly protected. Outside, the world turned into a swirling vortex of mud and water. The wagon rocked on its springs, a gentle, rhythmic swaying that felt like a cradle. Inside, it was dry, but the cold was creeping in, a damp, pervasive chill that sought out the warmth of their bodies. Clara was huddled in the corner of the blankets, her eyes wide, watching the shadow of the man beside her. Elias moved with that deceptive slowness of his. He struck a match, the small, bright flare of light illuminating his rugged features before he lit a small, shielded lantern. The warm, golden glow cast long, dancing shadows against the interior of the wagon, turning the cramped space into a sanctuary. He didn't sit away from her. He sat right there, his long legs folded, his massive frame taking up almost half the space. He knew the cold was biting. He knew she was still fighting the ghosts of her past, the memories of being locked out in the cold or made to sleep in damp, unheated rooms. "The storm will pass," he said, his voice dropping into that deep, resonant register that always seemed to settle the frantic fluttering of her heart. He began to unroll a second heavy wool blanket. It was thick, rough, and smelled of the wild, but it was warm. "We have enough supplies to wait it out." He didn't wait for her to ask. He draped the blanket over her shoulders, his fingers lingering for a fraction of a second against the soft fabric of her dress. The touch wasn't just physical. It was a reassurance, a silent acknowledgement that she was worth the warmth, worth the effort, worth the protection. Clara looked at him, the tears pooling in her eyes not from sadness, but from a profound, overwhelming sense of relief. For her entire adult life, she had been a person to be cast aside, a person to be hidden away. Here, in the belly of the wagon, with the world tearing itself apart just inches away, she was being treated like a treasure. The rain intensified, a relentless drumming roar that made conversation impossible. Elias leaned back against a crate of supplies, his eyes fixed on the lantern light. He looked tired. It was the first time she had really noticed it, the deep lines around his eyes, the slight slump of his broad shoulders. He carried the weight of the world, or at least the weight of their journey, and he did it without complaint. Clara felt a sudden, fierce urge to do something for him. She reached out, her hand hesitant, and touched his forearm. The muscle beneath his shirt was hard as iron, warm and steady. He turned his head, his blue eyes locking onto hers, and in that gaze there was no judgment, no expectation. There was only an invitation. "Rest your head, Clara," he murmured, tilting his head toward his shoulder. It was the same command, but softer this time, more of a request. She didn't fight it. She didn't try to shrink. She simply leaned over, her heavy, soft form finding a natural home against his side. The contrast was stark, her rounded, vulnerable softness against the sheer, powerful granite of his build. The silence between them was empty. It was filled with the unspoken language of two souls recognizing their ove kept no reflection in the other. As the storm raged outside, pounding the earth and testing the strength of the wagon, Clara felt a deep, profound peace settle over her. She thought about the woman she had been just a few days ago. The widow who apologized for taking up space, the woman who believed her size was a sin. That woman felt like a ghost, a remnant of a life she was shedding like a winter coat. She felt the steady, powerful rhythm of Elias' heart against her cheek. It was a slow, deliberate thrum, a heartbeat of a man who was unmoved by the chaos of the world. She realized then that she wasn't just being protected, she was being healed. Every gesture, every look, every moment of quiet shared space was mending the fractures in her spirit. She drifted in and out of a light, restful sleep, anchored by the solid presence beside her. Every time the wagon jolted, which happened often as the wind tried to push it from its place, Elias shifted, his arms sliding around her back, a reflexive, protective motion that did even seem to require him to be fully awake. He was her shield, even in his own rest. Hours bled into one another. The world outside the canvas seemed to have ceased to exist. There was only the rain, the darkness, the lantern, and the two of them. She woke up once in the dead of the night to find him staring at the roof of the wagon, his expression unreadable, thoughtful. He wasn't looking at anything in particular. He was just thinking. She didn't move. She wanted to stay exactly where she was. She wanted to savor this feeling of belonging, this feeling of being chosen. She whispered, so quietly he might have missed it. Why me, Elias? Why of all the people? Did you choose to look at me? She expected him to brush it off, to give some humble answer about how anyone would have done the same, or that it was just the right thing to do. He went silent for a long time. The only sound was the rhythmic thud of the rain. Then he turned his head, his gaze sweeping over her face with an intensity that made her skin tingle. Mot de not choose to look at you, Clara, he said, his voice gravelly and low. Mot couldn't help but see you. From the moment Mot saw you in that yard, fighting to hold on to what was left of your life, Mot de not see the size or the clothes or the dust. I saw the woman underneath. Mot saw the strength it took to keep standing when the whole world was trying to knock you down. He paused, his hand moving to gently brush a loose strand of hair from her face. Mot V spent my life looking for something real in a world that's mostly surface. You real, Clara. You the most real thing Mot V found on this trail. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The confession was simple, unadorned, and more powerful than any grand romantic gesture she could have imagined. She realized that he didn't see her through the lens of what she was supposed to be, but through the lens of who she actually was. He saw the resilience, the kindness, the hidden fire that had been dampened by years of abuse, and he was intimidated by it. He was drawn to it. She reached up, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, the rough stubble of his beard, the hardness of his cheek. He leaned into the touch, a rare, vulnerable movement that made her chest ache with affection. The storm didn't break until the early hours of the morning. When the wind finally died down and the rain slowed to a dull, rhythmic patter, the silence that followed was absolute. The world outside was soaked, the ground churned into a sea of mud, and the air was crisp with the scent of wet pine and ozone. Elias moved first, his body uncoiling with that slow, panther-like grace. He looked out through a gap in the canvas, checking the state of the camp. The other wagons were battered, the people huddled and miserable, their spirits dampened by the cold. He looked back at Clara, a faint, wry smile touching the corners of his mouth. The world is still here, he noted, his voice carrying that familiar, grounding calm. But the road is going to be difficult tomorrow. Clara stood up, her joints aching a little from the cramped position, but her spirit was lighter than air. She looked at the giant cowboy, the man who had pulled her from the dust, the man who had held her while the storm raged, the man who had told her she was real. She knew the road ahead was hard. She knew there were more miles, more challenges, more judgment from the narrow-minded folks in the caravan. But none of that mattered now. She had a home, not in a house or a structure, but in the space between them. She was safe, she was seen, she was cherished. And for the first time in her life, she was ready to face whatever the frontier threw at them, because she knew, with an absolute, unshakable certainty, that she wouldn't have to face it alone. Friends, when the storm finally broke, the world it left behind was a stark, muddy reminder that the frontier didn't care much for human convenience. The high plateau, usually a sweep of golden grass and stone, had been transformed into a thick, clinging mire. It was the kind of mud that swallowed wagon wheels whole and broke the spirit of men who thought they understood the land. We emerged from the back of the Studebaker into a silence so profound it felt heavy. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, innocent and uncaring of the chaos below. The camp was a disaster. The other wagons were listing to the side, buried up to the hubs in Vekepete clay, and the mood among the travelers was abysmal. They were shivering, their clothes caked in filth, their tempers shorter than a lit fuse. But as Mort watched from the sidelines, I saw the shift. The ordeal had fractured them, but it had tempered the two souls we are following. Elias stepped out first. He didn't complain about the mud. He didn't curse the sky. He just moved, his boots sinking into the muck, his eyes scanning the caravan with that cool, analytical precision. He was the anchor. If he was panicked, the whole group would have shattered, but he was calm, an island of stillness in the swirling mess. Clara followed him out and noticed something immediately. She wasn't holding her shawl tight to hide her curves anymore. She moved with a purpose. She saw the mess, she saw the misery of the others, and she didn't shrink. She grabbed the empty buckets, the very same ones she had struggled vacate hat days ago, and moved toward the creek. She was to just surviving, she was participating. The wagon master, a man named Holloway, who usually spent his days avoiding eye contact with Elias, was shouting at his team of exhausted oxen. They weren't moving. The mud had them paralyzed. He was red-faced, screaming, ready to whip the beasts into a frenzy. It was an ugly scene, the kind that makes your blood run cold. Elias walked over, his massive frame slicing through the mist like a ship through water. He didn't yell. He placed a hand on Holloway's shoulder, a hand that looked large enough to crush the man's collarbone, and the wagon master froze. "Violence doesn't move the mud, Holloway," Alice said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that could be heard over the wind. "Pulling together does." The camp fell silent. Holloway looked up at the giant, his eyes darting around for support, but he found none. Elias pointed to the line of wagons. "We unhitch the teams. We rig a pulley system to the lead wagon. We move them one by one. If we work as a train, we move. If we work as individuals, we stay here until the winter freezes us in place." It was a simple, logical plan, but it required a leader who could command respect. And for the first time, everyone, even the judgmental Mrs. Gable, looked to Elias for the order. He nodded toward the supplies. "Get the ropes. We have work to do." Clara spent the next 4 hours doing the work of 2 people. She was too strong like Elias. Not many people were, but she was resilient. She moved between the wagons, handing out water, clearing the debris from the wheels, and keeping the children from wandering into the dangerous mud. She didn't seek praise, but she earned it. When Mrs. Gable dropped her ladle into the muck, she didn't snap at Clara. She looked at her confused, as if she didn't know how to handle a woman who had been mocked, but was now the only one keeping the camp running. Clara picked it up, wiped it clean, and handed it back with a small, steady smile. It wasn't submissive, it was dignified. It was a quiet victory that hit harder than any argument. By midday, the sun was trying to break through, and the air was thick with the steam of drying mud. The team had successfully moved the first 3 wagons. Elias was soaked, his shirt clinging to his massive chest and back, revealing the incredible architecture of his muscles as he hauled on the ropes. He was to just pulling. He was practically carrying the weight of the effort on his own frame. He was a force of nature, a man who seemed fueled by a determination that went beyond the physical. Clara stood near the fire, stirring a pot of beans, watching him. She wasn't just looking at him as a savior anymore. She was looking at him as a man. She saw the way his muscles bunched under his skin, the way the sweat traced paths down his neck, the way he laughed, a rare, deep sound, when one of the younger men successfully rigged a knot. The tension in the camp had dissipated, replaced by the exhaustion of hard, honest work. But as evening approached, the old habits started to creep back in. Holloway was sitting near the fire, grumbling about the delay, casting dark looks toward Elias. "We read days behind schedule," he muttered to the men around him, "and we re-burning through supplies like we re in a famine. If Vance hadn't insisted on that extra baggage, we'd be over the pass by now." He was implying, without saying it, that Clara was the weight that had doomed them. The air in the circle grew cold. Men shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Elias, who was sitting just a few feet away, cleaning his boots. He didn't look up immediately. He just kept wiping the mud from the leather, his movements precise and calm. But Moat saw his jaw tighten. I saw the way his fingers paused. Clara, who was serving the beans, heard the comment. In the past, she would have dropped the ladle. She would have apologized. She would have walked away. Instead, she set the ladle down, stood tall, and turned to look at Holloway. "The delay wasn't caused by my weight, Mr. Holloway," she said, her voice clear and steady, vibrating with a strength that surprised even herself. "It was caused by a storm that would have stopped any of us. And if you're concerned about supplies, perhaps you should look at the extra crates of whiskey you brought to sell at the settlement. My trunk is 1 box. Your greed is a wagon load." The silence that followed was absolute. Mrs. Gable gasped. Holloway's face turned a violent shade of purple, his mouth hanging open in shock. He looked at Clara, then at Elias, expecting the giant to silence her. Instead, Elias stood up. He didn't look at Holloway. He looked at Clara. There was a spark in his eyes. not of anger but of intense burning pride. He walked over to her side, his towering presence shielding her, but he didn't need to say a word. He just placed a hand on the small of her back, a possessive, protective gesture that told everyone in the circle that she was under his shield and that her voice was his voice. Holloway stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the dirt. "You watch your tongue, woman," he threatened, his voice thin. Elias stepped forward, not aggressively, but with an inevitability that made Holloway stumble back. "She speaks the truth," Elias said, his voice dropping into that dangerous low register. "And don't appreciate being told to watch how she speaks. We are a train. We succeed together. If you have a problem with her, you have a problem with me. And don't to think you want to have a problem with me." Holloway glared, clutching his hat, then turned and walked away into the darkness, his retreat humiliating and total. The camp settled down, but the energy had changed. The respect for Elias had grown into a kind of fearful awe, and the curiosity about Clara had turned into a grudging, wary admiration. After the fire died down and the others had retreated to their wagons, Elias and Clara remained, sitting on their log. The night was cold, but the fire was warm, and the silence between them was comfortable, filled with the intimacy of a shared battle. "You didn't have to do that," Clara whispered, looking into the flames. "Mort did do anything," Elias replied, his voice soft. "You did it. You stood up for yourself." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers spanning her palm. "That took more courage than anything Mort did in the mud today." Clara looked at him, searching his face. "Why did you really come out here, Elias? You don't have the look of a man who needed to escape anything. You look like a man who knows exactly who he is." Elias stared into the fire for a long time, the shadows dancing across his rugged face. He began to talk, not of the ranch, or the cattle, or the wealth he had built. He spoke of the East. He spoke of a life that was stifled by expectations, of a society that valued lineage over character, and of a tragedy that had stripped him of everything he thought he wanted. He spoke of the guilt he had carried for years, the feeling that he had let down those who depended on him. He told her that he had come west not to find riches, but to find a place where he could be measured by his actions, not his name. "I thought Moat needed to be alone," he confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "I thought if Moat didn't let anyone get close, Moat could fail them again." He looked at her, his blue eyes reflecting the orange glow of the embers. But out here in the silence, Mort realized that living is just about surviving. It's about letting someone in. It's about building something that matters. Clara felt a lump form in her throat. She understood the weight of his guilt. She understood the desire to be invisible. She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched his face. "You haven't failed anyone, Elias. You chose to save me, and must think that matters more than anything else you've ever done." He didn't pull away. He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing, a look of profound, aching peace washing over his features. The barrier between them, that invisible wall of protector and protected, had dissolved. They were two broken, beautiful people finding a way to fit their pieces together. As the moon climbed high above the mountains, casting a silver light over the camp, the stillness was absolute. The wagon was nearby, their safe harbor, but neither wanted to move. They sat there, hand in hand, the giant cowboy and the widow, and for the first time the future didn't look like a long, lonely trek across a barren land. It looked like a path they could walk together. But as Moat watched them, Moat couldn't help but notice the horizon to the west. A strange, unnatural, flickering light was playing against the clouds. Not lightning, not the stars. It was a rhythmic pulse, a warning, or perhaps a sign. The journey was far from over, and the mountains had a way of hiding secrets until the very last moment. Clara, leaning her head on Elias' shoulder, saw it too. She tightened her grip on his hand, not out of fear, but out of a sudden, deep intuition that the biggest test of their journey was still waiting for them in the valley ahead. They sat there, watching the strange light pulse in the dark, the giant and the woman he had chosen, ready to face whatever the frontier had in store, together. The flickering light that danced against the clouds that final night was not a wildfire, nor was it a sign of danger. It was the soft, golden glow of the settlement, casting its hope against the vast, indifferent darkness of the frontier. As the dawn broke, bleeding over the jagged horizon in shades of bruised peach and violet, the caravan finally crested the last ridge of the high pass. Below us lay the valley, a verdant, bowl-shaped sanctuary protected by towering pines and granite peaks. It was everything the prospectors and ranchers had promised. For Clara, looking down at the settlement, the sight was nothing short of miraculous. She had spent her entire life believing she was an unwanted burden, a woman whose mere presence was an annoyance to those around her. But as she stood there, the cool morning air biting at her cheeks, she felt a profound sense of ownership. She had survived. She had stood tall. She had found a partner who saw the beauty in her existence when she had been blind to it herself. The caravan descended the winding trail, the iron-rimmed wheels groaning against the rocky earth. The mood in the train had shifted entirely. Gone was the bickering and the frantic, fearful energy of the storm. In its place was a quiet, contemplative air. The people who had mocked Clara throughout the journey were silent, their eyes fixed on the valley floor. Perhaps they were finally realizing that the world they were entering didn't care about their petty cruelties. Perhaps they were seeing in the quiet, stoic figure of Elias and the resilient, graceful presence of Clara a different kind of strength, a strength that didn't need to shout to be heard. As we pulled into the square of the nascent town, the air was filled with the smell of wet earth and freshly cut timber. The locals had gathered curious and wary, but as Elias guided the Studebaker into the center of the clearing, he didn't stop. He turned the team toward the edge of the town, where a large, flat parcel of land bordered the rushing river. He pulled the horses to a halt, the sudden silence of the stopped wagon ringing in our ears. This was the claim. This was the place where he intended to build his life. Holloway, the wagon master, pulled up alongside us, his face a mask of irritation and exhaustion. He looked at the land, then at Elias, his pride still wounded by the events of the previous day. He muttered something about the land being unsuitable, about the soil being too rocky, trying to find one last way to diminish the man who had outmatched him at every turn. Elias didn't even look at him. He climbed down from the wagon, his massive boots sinking into the soft, dark soil. He walked to the back of the wagon and extended a hand to Clara. She took it, her heart hammering against her ribs, and stepped down, her feet hitting the earth with a sensation of finality. She was home. "It will be hard work," Elias said, his voice deep and steady, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the air. He was talking to the wagon master. He was talking to Clara. "The winters are brutal and the spring thaw will test the foundations, but it will be our work and it will be our home." Clara looked around the vast open space. She saw the potential for a garden, a small orchard near the creek, a porch where she could sit in the cool of the evening. She saw for the first time a future that didn't involve apology. She turned to Elias, her eyes searching his face, looking for any hesitation. She found none. He was as immovable as the mountain behind them, yet as open as the valley before them. She reached out, her hand resting on his arm, and felt the solid, warm muscle beneath the fabric of his shirt. It was a gesture of solidarity, a silent agreement to face the challenges of the frontier together. The days that followed were a blur of construction and adaptation. The town, initially wary, soon came to realize that the giant cowboy and the widow were not people to be trifled with. Elias began the work of raising a cabin, hauling logs from the nearby forest with a raw, terrifying strength that left the onlookers breathless. He didn't use a block and tackle. He used his own body, his own grit, but he wasn't alone. Clara was there every step of the way, organizing the supplies, tending to the hearth, and even learning how to cure the hides and prepare the timber. The townspeople, led by the same Mrs. Gable who had once called her a burden, began to drift by, first out of curiosity, then out of necessity, and finally out of genuine respect. They saw the way Clara moved, with a newfound confidence, her back straight, her chin high, her soft, beautiful features radiating a peace that was entirely contagious. One afternoon, as the sun was setting and the sky was a riot of color, Clara was sitting on a pile of fresh-cut cedar, watching Elias work. He was shirtless, his broad shoulders glistening with sweat, his massive back muscles flexing capote at every swing of the axe. The sight was undeniably powerful, but it wasn't the strength that drew her eye. It was the gentleness. Every time he stopped to wipe his brow, he would look over at her, his glacial blue eyes softening in a way that made her breath catch. He walked over, the axe hanging loosely in his hand, and sat down beside her. He was covered in sawdust and sweat, but he smelled like the forest, clean, sharp, and intensely alive. "You've been working too hard, Clara," he said, his voice soft, lacking any of the scolding tone she had once feared. "You don't need to do everything yourself." Clara looked at him, her heart full. "Mauvais capanote too," she replied. "For the first time in my life, the work feels like it belongs to me. It feels like mot building something that matters. It's not about earning my keep, Elias. It's about creating something beautiful." He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw an understanding that went deeper than words. He reached out, his hand, calloused and enormous, cupping her face. The sensation was electric, a grounding force that pulled her into the center of his world. "You are the beauty, Clara," he whispered, his voice vibrating through her. "The cabin is just walls, the land is just dirt. Without you, it's just a place to exist. With you, it's a life." He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a kiss that was slow, deliberate, and filled with a profound, quiet hunger. It wasn't the frantic, desperate kiss of two people trying to escape their reality. It was the steady, grounding kiss of two people who had finally arrived at their destination. In that moment, surrounded by the towering pines and the rushing river, the ghosts of her past, the mockery, the abandonment, the crushing weight of her own self-doubt, finally vanished. They were replaced by the reality of the man in front of her, the giant who had seen her worth when she couldn't see, the protector who had taught her that strength wasn't about being untouchable. It was about being vulnerable enough to love. As the weeks turned into months, the cabin grew, a sturdy, beautiful structure built from the land itself. It had a porch that overlooked the valley, a hearth that roared with the warmth of their shared fire, and a peace that seemed to settle over the entire homestead. The town began to look to them for guidance, not because they demanded it, but because they exemplified a way of living that was rare in the harshness of the West. They lived with integrity, with quiet kindness, and with a resilience that inspired everyone who saw them. The final test came with the first snow of the year. The frontier winter arrived with a vengeance, a blinding, swirling whiteout that threatened to isolate the settlement completely. The town scrambled, panic setting in as the temperature plummeted. Families were cold, their woodpiles running low, their spirits fraying. But Clara and Elias were prepared. They had spent the autumn months gathering, storing, and organizing. When the storm hit, they didn't just hunker down. They opened their doors. They welcomed the families into their cabin, the roaring fire at the heart of their home acting as a beacon in the storm. Elias spent the days hauling wood and clearing the paths, his massive frame unfazed by the sub-zero temperatures. Clara spent the time feeding the hungry, mending the torn clothes of the children, and holding space for the weary. She wasn't the widow who was a burden. She was the heart of the settlement. She was the woman who had transformed her own trauma into a deep, unending well of empathy. One night, when the fire was burning low and the wind was howling against the sturdy log walls, the cabin was finally quiet. The guests were asleep, tucked into blankets around the fire, their worries temporarily forgotten. Elias and Clara were sitting in the small private corner they had carved out for themselves. The silence was heavy, but it was a good silence, a silence that felt earned. Elias was exhausted, the strain of the storm clearly etched into the lines of his rugged face. He sat back, his eyes closing, his breathing slow and measured. Clara watched him, a fierce, overwhelming love swelling in her chest. She realized that he had never once complained, never once hesitated to give everything he had to help the people who had once treated them with such indifference. He had proved through every action that his strength was not just for protection, it was for service. She reached out, her hand resting on his knee, and he opened his eyes, looking at her with a depth of affection that made her knees feel weak. "You did it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved them." He shook his head, a small, weary smile touching his lips. "We did it, Clara, together." He reached out, taking her hand and pulling her closer. "Do you remember the first night? On the wagon?" Clara nodded, the memory vivid in her mind. "Mort told you to rest your head," he said, his voice a low, resonant hum. "Mort think you've been doing that ever since. Not due it to resting your head, but resting your soul. Letting go of the fear, letting go of the weight." Clara looked at him, the tears finally spilling over, hot and real. "Mot have," she confessed. "Mot don't feel heavy anymore, Elias. Mot don't feel like mot met taking up too much space. Mot feel light. Mot feel like mot met finally walking on solid ground." He pulled her into his arms, his massive frame shielding her from the cold, his warmth soaking into her bones. She tucked her head against his shoulder, the scent of cedar and wood smoke filling her senses. It was the same position they had been in on that first terrifying night, but everything had changed. Then, she had been a frightened woman, searching for a place to hide. Now, she was a woman who had built a foundation. She was a woman who was loved. She closed her eyes, the sound of the storm outside no longer a threat, but a reminder of the peace they had created. She rested her head against the hard, comforting muscle of his shoulder, and for the first time in her life, she truly understood the meaning of the word home. It wasn't a place. It wasn't a structure. It was the man beside her. It was the promise of tomorrow. It was the quiet, steady strength of a giant who had chosen to be her anchor. As she drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep, the fire cast its final, flickering glow across the room, illuminating the faces of the people they had helped, the people who had once judged them, but now saw them as the pillars of their community. The journey had been long, the path had been brutal, and the mountains had been unforgiving. But they had made it. They had survived, and in doing so, they had found something that was worth more than all the gold in the hills. They had found each other. And so, my friends, the story of the giant cowboy and the woman who taught him to love does end with a grand speech or a battle won with steel. It ends here in the quiet, steady rhythm of a life built on trust, on resilience, and on the simple, profound act of standing by one another when the world is at its coldest. It ends with a woman who reclaimed her worth, and a man who found a reason to let someone in. It ends with the realization that the greatest frontier isn't the one that stretches out before us, but the one that lies within. The courage to heal, the strength to forgive, and the wisdom to know that when we rest our heads against the right heart, we are finally, truly, whole. Mote hope this story has brought some warmth to your fire today. If you felt the weight of Clara's journey or the steadfast strength of Elias's protection, then Mote have done my job well. These stories are a reminder that even when the world feels cruel and cold, there is always a chance for kindness, for healing, and for a love that stands as tall as the mountains. If you found a piece of your own heart reflected in this tale, do me a kindness and hit that subscribe button. It keeps our fire burning and ensures these stories continue to find their way to those who need them most. Until next time, keep your head high and your heart open, because you never know when you meet the person who will help you carry the load. This is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment and educational purposes. The characters, events, and situations in this story are entirely imaginary. Any resemblance to real people or real events is purely coincidental. This content was created with the help of AI tools and has been carefully edited by us, all rights reserved.